I'm very excited to be speaking with Charlotte Cowell, esoterist, writer, and translator of several magical works from the Russian Silver Age. The Russian Silver Age, which exploded onto the scene with enough dazzling and creative pomp to stand through the ages, has produced some of the greatest literature the Christian world has ever known, rivaling the Italian Renaissance in terms of its contributions to the arts, both religious and secular. Among the chief figures of the age, we find many classic household names such as Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Berdiev, Mikhail Bulgakov, as well as less known ones, perhaps in the West, Sergei Bulgakov, Vladimir Solovyov, Pavel Florensky, obviously Rasputin and the Callisti, Helena Blavatsky, Grigory Moyebis, G.I. Gurdjieff, P.D. Uspensky, Boris Muraviev, Nikolai Roerich, Vladimir Shmakov, Nina Roudnikova, and perhaps most importantly, Valentin Tomberg. Charlotte, what the hell was going around in Russia at this time? What produced this huge flowering of creative thought?
Oh gosh. Well, it's funny actually because I like your audience also started with Tomberg. So I kind of approached it from now going backwards. And of course, the further back you go, the deeper the history gets, this rabbit hole opens and suddenly you're in a very different world. I mean, I guess Russia has had a kind of love-hate relationship with esotericism, depending on the ruler that was in charge at the time. But if you come right up to the start of the 20th century, you get the Tsar Nicholas's, or Nikolai, his edict of the toleration of religion, which meant that a lot of what had been kind of persecuted and suppressed prior to his rule suddenly could come out into the open. So from kind of 1905 up until the war and the catastrophic Bolshevik Revolution, you had this opening up of the esoteric world and a great outpouring of spirituality. I mean, it sort of sprang out of a theosophical movement as well, but the ability to practice openly was what kind of really opened the doors. And therefore, you were able to have a figure like Moibus or Mebis, or however you pronounce these names. It's Swedish, actually, his name. He wasn't just practicing his kind of esoteric work in secret. He was also teaching a course at the local mathematical school. He was a mathematics professor, and I've honed on him as a grandfather of this tradition, really, because he produced a masterwork in his Encyclopedia of Occultism, the Tarot Majors and Minors, which informed really the rest of this school in a major way. So he was working as a teacher of quite young people. I mean, I started studying his work, rather late in life. I think I must have been in my 40s. And he was teaching 17-year-olds. And, I think I've marveled many times how amongst the elite of that time, because I think you would have to call them an elite in one way or another, the level of education was absolutely mind-blowing. From Valentin Tomberg as well, these people spoke so many languages, not just modern languages, but Hebrew, Sanskrit. They're looking at hieroglyphics. So there's an incredible breadth and depth of knowledge, and it's kind of coming into this mystical ferment. And I think also there's something peculiar about the Russian mind in this respect. I think there's sort of quite a psychic quality and a fieriness, an awakeness to kind of psychic principles and esotericism that's very pronounced in that part of the world and amongst Slavic peoples. So, that the kind of occult seed fell into very fertile soil, you would say. So there was this window, this edict of toleration of religion in 1905. And during this time that some of these magical groups began to form. I mean, the influences are myriad. You couldn't really pinpoint any one thing. I mean, call it the tarot work, I guess, because, that's broadly speaking how I'm looking at it, as the symbolic door. It's part of a synthetic philosophy, as they call it, la philosophie synthétique, from the French tradition, the French Martinist tradition. That's where I guess that name would come from. And they're drawing on immense traditions. So, the Kabbalah in the work of Moebius is very pronounced. And that, of course, dovetails nicely with his mathematical training. that in turn also is connected with Pythagorean philosophy. You've got kind of the Russian Sophianic traditions, very, very important. The principle of unity that you get from Solovyov, reconciling binaries into a mystical unity. Sanskrit, the Bhagavad Gita, as well as the Vedic stuff. There's so many influences that, trying to sort of say it came from, what just one thread would be quite tricky. But you would, of course, have titanic figures like Madame Blavatsky, who you mentioned. She was an immense influence, not just on the Russians, but the rest of the world. I think whatever, it's certainly possible to criticize her or be a fan, or somewhere in between. But she was a one-off character. She was a very, very influential person. And when she opened the floodgates, it wasn't just in Russia, but it went, it came all the way to the West with her. There's other figures as well, but you could go on because it's quite a long list of influential Russians, as you'd said, and you've even got the kind of bringing in the regular literature, the Tolstoys and the Bulgakovs, some of these wonderful people you mentioned before I think we started recording. So it's a lot of influences. But with Moebius as well, I mean, he was a Freemason. I'm not, so I'm certainly not going to try and speak authoritatively about that, but it's known that he was a master mason at that time in St. Petersburg. That would also have put him into connection really with the court circles, the imperial circles, where you had, for some time, esotericists had been coming from France and beyond, Papou, Martyr de Philippe, these types of people. So, there's influences coming from all over the continent into Russia at that time. I once actually made a list, it's a shame I don't have it to hand, of all the people who were visiting St. Petersburg around this time, and what an incredible hotbed it was, because this, having lived under such kind of oppression for so long, the Russian soul certainly has suffered, and the whole surrounding area, of course, the Soviets and former Soviets, it's a land of, where people have suffered a lot, but it seems that there's this concentrated moment where they could blossom, and that's when you had the flower of the intelligentsia, which is how Valentin Tomberg described this group of people that he became aware of when he left Russia. He went to Estonia as a refugee, and that was where he encountered Nina Roudnikova, who told him the stories and, as he said, initiated him into all that she and they knew. So yeah, now I feel like I've been talking for a long time. So you must have another question now before I just get my mouth goes dry.
I could the you used the descriptor fiery personalities. I think it struck a chord because that basically describes all of them. I mean, what do Helena Blavatsky and Vladimir Soloviev have in common, if not a fiery personality? And and perhaps that's it in terms of those two. But this movement is full of such passion in all of these different figures.
That's funny, actually, you said that, because when I first became interested in Moebius, and, because at first I just became curious, and then over time it became, an absolute fascination. And I was starting to really think about this person and to think about the book, which, before I even read it. And I always imagined him as just a really fiery person, like for some reason, like red hair, red mustache. And I just had this image in my head of indeed a very fiery person, kind of literally on the coalface of the struggle for existence, which they were in Russia at that time. And also Tomberg, he was described when he came to Bangor in England. There was some kind of anthroposophical conference that he attended as a speaker, and he was described as a comet which came kind of shooting through the sky, that the people there were just absolutely dazzled by him, his vivacity and his, what he would describe, I think, as like creative elan, is a term that he uses in Meditations on the Tarot as a kind of hallmark of the quintessence, the fifth element. That's probably, I would have thought, in the Pope Arcanum, although I'm not sure. So yes, I think that fiery principle is really, like you'll say, I see the same thing. So I think that's really perceptive. And also it kind of ties in with this shin element that, well, there's a whole thing about the letter shin, but suffice to say, it's the mother letter of fire. And for this group in particular, it was very important.
Yeah, the shin goes beyond just Hebrew. Aish is a word for fire in many ancient languages, and
Hmm.
it's related to the etheric element. Absolutely. Um, yeah, Valentin Tomberg, you see photos of him, and he might write like the most austere, contemplative, priestly figure, but you could see the lightning bolt in his eyes. Uh,
Yeah.
it is fascinating. So give me perhaps a chronology of thinkers. You've already touched on this a little bit in terms of Moibus and Roudnikova to Tomberg. What was Did any of them have any experience with each other beyond, for, let's say, did they travel in the same circles? Would they have known each other personally well, or was it mainly through correspondences, through shared interests or letters? Did distance separate them? Things like this.
Well, there were definite connections. So Moibus, they all were connected to circles, sort of, in several different circles. Moibus was at the kind of center of all of the ones in St. Petersburg. He was working with his wife, who was also very well connected. And Nina Roudnikova, she was kind of the star pupil of, I think, the Promethean group. She was really the star of the group, because she kept the notes. It was her that preserved the notes of the tarot miners, and the tarot miners were taught as that was the inner circle teaching. The majors were taught to more people in an outer circle, but the miners were considered a more kind of the work of an initiate. So she was the one who rescued these notes, and also, of course, produced her own masterwork, The Solar Way. She's very important. She's really, I came to realize, the bridge between them, because I was first attracted to Moebius, which I think is right, as the person at the center, but I wanted to kind of move on to Shmakov next, because he's very prominent in Meditations on the Tarot. His Holy Book of Thoth is cited as something that Valentin Tomberg wants to resurrect, and he certainly pays homage to it in the book. So I wanted to move on to that one next, but something just stopped me. For 2 years, I bought the Russian book, it was quite difficult to get. And I just kind of looked at it for 2 years. I thought, I just cannot, it was like it was locked. And then I had a good conversation with Eugene, who's art theurg. If you have the Book of Thoth, he's the one who designed the wonderful tarot images. He is Russian and an occultist working within the Shmakov school. And he was very helpful, actually. Some of the more difficult things to translate, he gave me pointers on those. So he was wonderful. But he said to me, really, it's Nina Roudnikova is the one that's the bridge between them, between Moebius and Shmakov, and you need to kind of understand her first, and that will open the door. So I thought, well, great, that good advice. I'll do that. And her work, of course, it's a great relief, because Moebius, it's so deep and occult and astral, and you blew my mind in every possible way. With her, it's much lighter and more lucid. It's more everyman. That's a good thing. You can get to the truth more easily. It's not all veiled and shrouded. So she was really in her own way a Shin element, the person who attracted. So when she left Russia, she escaped with the retreating White Russian army when, after the Bolshevik Revolution, with her husband. She was aristocratic, baroness, married to a baron, and they went to Estonia, and she really was at the center of the whole Russian diaspora. She was considered to be a healer and a teacher. She also was a magazine editor. She was a poet. She ended up working as a spy for the White Russian cause. She had a correspondence which went round the world. She was corresponding with the Ruriks, of course, another very crucial name in this whole Russian story. It's strange that they seem to not be properly connected to this group, because they really had their own world going on with, the search for Shambhala and that kind of thing. But she was in a correspondence with them as Theosophist, and this correspondence appeared in the journal Occultism and Yoga by Michael Asiv, which was sent around the world to the Russians who were in exile, the White Russians. So she was very important, and it's interesting, actually, because you can get all the copies of this journal that were published, and they're all full of fascinating works, but the one she edited you can't get, and I think she was, you know, because she was a spy, she's one of the ones who really went into kind of the burn pile of the Bolsheviks. You know, it's tragic really, because she did save a lot of notes, but her own materials were lost. Her daughter, I can't remember the circumstances of her daughter having to also flee wherever they were as a refugee, but the upshot was the daughter was trying to jump on a train, and the bag of the mother's notes just got left behind. There wasn't enough room. So she's just, you know, but she was very important. And as I said earlier, she initiated Valentin Tomberg. So that's where the unbroken chain really comes in, from Moebius to her to Tomberg. He also had another pupil called Nicholas Geerse. So I'm having a drink. So Nicholas Geerse was also a member of the Inner Circle group in St. Petersburg, and he's another extraordinary figure. I mean, there's even less. I mean, I came to sort of find out him because he's the one that ended up with the tarot miners in South America, and he's an even more enigmatic figure from my point of view, because he left. He ended up in Germany. So having survived Stalin, Lenin and Stalin, he then survived Hitler. Went to South America, and he was found in Martinist groups, secret Martinist circles all around Europe along the way, the details of which I don't know, even if they still exist. And he ended up in, was it Chile? I think it was Chile, and he became very beloved leader of a, you know, rarefied Martinist group in Chile. They'd received an initiation, I think, from Papu's son, but they broke with them as the Russians had done before them, and you know, they founded, you know, they became the leaders of their own group, and he managed to obtain a copy of the Tarot Miners, which Nina Roudnikova had given to her friend who'd gone to South America. So there was this kind of chain that went round the world, mostly underground, but then obviously when we got the internet and people started publishing things and talking about the work, Nicholas Geerse also died, sadly, and his group posted tributes to him. So, you know, that's another thread. Then back in Russia, you have Shmakov. So Shmakov was in Moscow. I don't know if he met Moebius. He certainly read his book, The Encyclopedia of Occultism, because he cites that as one of his own sources and as being the kind of foundational text, really, for all their studies. But he had his own circles going on, and he was also giving a lot of lectures. It was a kind of bohemian group. I think they were probably all bohemian groups, but we know the names of quite a few of the ones in Shmakov's circle. I can't name them off the top of my head. I do list some of them in the book, but they were kind of the artist Monin. That's one that springs to mind because I think he was the youngest of the group, and he also survived. I think he kept the materials long after the others had gone to gulags or been suicided or suffered some other awful fate. He kept everything going, and the sort of Shmakov branch, if you like, went through different incarnations because he actually passed his lineage on to someone called Belustin, and it took a different turn. But the upshot is that group kind of survived to the present day. So that's all an unbroken chain, but it did split off. And if you've studied Shmakov's work, you can see why, because whereas the others, Moebius and Tomberg, they're more recognizably kind of Martinist, and or some might say like a Rosicrucian style of work that's bringing in Kabbalah. It's got the synthetic element, it's Christian, you know, you've got the Tetragrammaton, that's all kind of recognizable. Whereas with Shmakov, he's really trying to kind of reconcile Vedanta with Kabbalah, and which is a massive undertaking, obviously, but he's going a lot more metaphysical than into the astral occultism of Moebius or the Christ-centeredness of Tomberg. He's getting really metaphysical, is Shmakov. And I mean, and I don't even know how he wrote what he wrote. You know, he would only have been about 23 when he wrote the Book of Thoth, and you know, it's got 900 citations or thereabouts in that book, and he's done another book, Pneumatology, with a similar number. So it just, like I say, it blows my mind again how he read so much on the one hand and then produced these works. But he's got, his kind of legacy was interesting because the groups certainly took a different turn, I would say.
The to write it at such a young age is emblematic of all these figures. They seem to be, first of all, heavily politically active, most of them, on the one hand, and number two, the human quality is so ridiculously, absurdly high. To be able
Mm,
to have these sorts of insights, I mean, reading is one thing, but to be able to pen these works at such a young age
I
is
know.
truly incredible and can only point to, as far as I could see it, divine vocation. I mean, how else would you explain that? I
Well,
mean,
he writes in his diary, there was I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, Vladimir Shmakov went to sleep and Ben Alaman awoke. And it seems that he did have some kind of mystical download experience where I don't know, he felt that he was either overshadowed by this Kabbalist called Ben Alaman, or he had a memory awakening of being this. I don't know what his belief was in that respect, but it seems that once he had this awakening, that's when, you know, the outpouring came and he started writing this stuff. Like you say, it can only be, yeah, because reading it's one thing, understanding it, that's another. Sometimes I read a paragraph, 20 times, I'm thinking, crikey, but they're actually writing it as well. And like you say, so young. I mean, they, being aristocrats, they did have families who were educated. Shmakov, whose father was a notorious anti-Semite. That was another thing that troubled me about, that didn't pass on to Shmakov, but the father was highly problematic, very. There's a sort of terrible case involving the father as a lawyer in Moscow, but he did have a massive library, massive occult library, as indeed did Madame Blavatsky's grandfather. But after the revolution or during the Civil War, Shmakov, the library, obviously he inherited this, went, they said, to three corners of the empire on three carts. So there was three cartloads of books that got sent the archives to different parts of the Russian Empire at the time, because that's how much material there was. And then Shmakov left himself quite late. Shmakov actually was rescued by the first president of Czechoslovakia, whose first name was Thomas. Don't ask me to pronounce the second name. People can Google that one. But he was a friend of Shmakov's and helped him escape when the time came. And then from there he went to South America, and the kind of, we lose the trail. There was some information about a man called Victor that I write about that in the afterword to the Book of Thoth. I just sort of put in there all the information I could find, because I thought, well, there isn't, there's only a certain amount out there. The stuff in the KGB records, which you can read, they're online. There's public records where they describe the activities of the group, and also the order Emesh Redivivus, which sprang out of it again. There were a lot of occult groups, and as you say, they were in their minds ranged in a battle, the apocalypse, the holy war against the Bolsheviks. Yeah, so they had a awful time, I would say.
yeah, I guess it was justified in a sense. Yeah. Why don't we take a quick smoke break and I'll be right back.
Okay.
We can continue. Zoom does a thing where
that was like secret.
uh,
Well, we were talking about the resolving of binaries and that being the great hermetic task, which I think it absolutely is. Everything to do with our lives on Earth. You've got this constant paradox and dichotomy and these, parallel universe and things, things that you have to resolve that seem irreconcilable. And it really is the great work, and a large proportion of, the resolution of binaries comes up in the Hermit's Arcanum, in Meditations on the Tarot, but in Moebius, it's from the first Arcanum, the Magician, and he kind of leaves us in no doubt whatsoever that resolving binaries is the work. not just any binary, not just, I don't know, red or blue politics, which really would be a false binary anyway. Nina Roudnikova, that's where she comes in, because she talks about how the correct setting of binaries is the art of living, and how so much conflict in the world comes from the setting of false binaries, which we see every day in politics, being the absolutely obvious example of this, where you've got two apparently contending parties, but in the end, it seems the same people always seem to win. So therefore, it's a false binary that we're drawn into trying to solve, and always going to be frustrated because that's not the binary. So correctly setting the binaries is the art of living, and the key to the work that takes you up the triangle, through that point, through the eye of the needle, that's so difficult to get through. I mean, we're also sort of seeing this in relation to the idea of being, I suppose, to put it in a nutshell, completely egotistical or completely Christ-centered, and how, really being Christ-centered would be desirable, the goal for me. It would be the way. But then if I look at the admiration that I have for, I said Led Zeppelin, I like lots of music, not just rock, but I do think they kind of exemplify that, particularly as they were also occultists. So in that situation, you've got people who are kind of apparently the opposite of Christ-centered, because they're totally self-centered, and yet they're producing what at least some people consider to be great art. You could use an even much better example, Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man. There's a person definitely with an ego, but look what they produced. So Tomberg himself also talks about the artist Elias, and the artist being greater than the hermeticist. So, in the one hand, we're kind of going through a whole book, 22 letters in a thick book, that's taken us away from that. But I suppose it boils down to having the talent and the ability to do it, I guess, because he does kind of write about that. If I could paint an amazing picture, write an amazing piece of music, then I probably wouldn't be publishing books by somebody else. If you've got that talent, I suppose it's used. So perhaps it's a different situation.
It's a very difficult struggle, and it's one that's perhaps more relevant than ever in the 21st century. The distinction between individualism versus selfless, um, I hate to use the word moralism, but we'll just more broadly describe it as piety, because there's a big
Mm-hmm.
temptation in the occult sphere to just ramp up the ego and play it off as spiritual. It's a great example too, Led Zeppelin, because
There is.
it's everyone has inside of them, they want to be some sort of Led Zeppelin, and yet the image of Christ is not particularly appealing.
Yeah.
He's garishly leaning against a cross in the desert. It's just a very different image, and yet you do have these masterminds who could blend all throughout this whole Russian school. All these figures can blend all the highs and lows of the humanities and of the arts, and then still manage to make it symbiotic with a religious messaging, which I think is especially in Tomberg,
Mm.
it's very just deeply profound. The range of emotion, the depth of the psychology of these people is incredible. For any listeners of this, especially personal friends who are fans of Valentin Tomberg, you're definitely going to want to check out Charlotte Cowell's publications of Nina Roudnikova, because Roudnikova, I found, is among this whole sphere the most similar in style to Tomberg. Would you agree with that?
I think I would, yes. And actually, really, there's almost exact phrase in all of them. There are phrases that appear almost exactly in one book to another. And I found it really fascinating, because at first glance, I thought, well, maybe this is quite different to Tomberg. But when I really kind of looked into the text, I could see the incredible influence that he'd had as well as Nina Roudnikova in different ways. There's so many respondances. It's not identical, because, like I said, Tomberg is much more Christ-centric than they are, even though I do think they would have been Christian, but more kind of a theosophical, type of Christian, I think, not like Tomberg. So, but yeah, I think she probably was the most like him, and of course, she was the one that initiated him as well. And Tomberg's wife, actually, she was also, because going back to originally what you asked about how the group was connected, Tomberg's wife, she I believe, knew Moebius, because she definitely attended at least one lecture of his in St. Petersburg. So she was a really important link. I think she was also semi-aristocratic or aristocratic. She'd been the wife, he married actually the wife of his best friend. It was all very amicable. But the best friend as well, I think it's Belosvatov, he also wrote an incredible kind of 9-page volume detailing all the work of the Russian school. And that was really the history of that movement in kind of 9 volumes. But the others made him burn it. They made him get rid of the work because I think they were so afraid of him uncovering. He basically named too many names for people within the regime in Russia. And during the Cold War, it was a very dangerous time. So they persuaded him to destroy the work, which of course is for us very frustrating, because that was really a case of somebody spilling the beans. You talk about disclosure. That was actually somebody who did do that, but they made him burn the work. So it seems there's always something that's got to be a mystery.
Yeah, that's a tremendous loss. Is there something you mentioned earlier about the KGB archives, going through the archives looking for these figures? Is there any historical detail regarding any of them that you find particularly enigmatic, that you would like that mysterious, we'll say?
Well, I think a lot of the archive that I was researching related to the order MS Redivivus, which kind of sprung up really after the time of Moebius. It was around the time of the Leningrad Freemasons, where Moebius was sent to a gulag. The groups were dispersing and being discovered, and a younger order, a very underground order, was formed in Moscow, ranged to kind of, they'd inherited from Shmakov, and there were a lot of different occult groups working there, but this order, Mesh, they went very, very deep. So they had their headquarters close to the headquarters of the secret police. So they were within a couple of 100 yards in a basement of a huge property. There were a couple of people, Taja and Tchaikovsky, who owned this property, and the father of Tchaikovsky was involved as well. And they had this basement where the order had its headquarters. And the KGB archive relating to that is just amazing, really. I reproduced it almost in full in my occult novel, The Eidolons, because I just thought there's certain pieces of information that are just so, I just think they need to be out there. And anyway, the upshot was that this order had been operating very close to the secret police. For one reason or another, the secret police came to the upstairs bit of the building to actually visit the father for one reason or another. I don't know, to see if he was complying in a way that he should be, like all citizens. And in doing so, they then just opened the door in the basement and discovered this room and the kind of litany of things that they found in here. It was like kind of Dr. D's secret magician's room. They had a psychic machine on the table, which had a clump of Stalin's hair in it. So it actually was a clump of Stalin's hair. It'd taken it from his barber. And they were attempting to influence Stalin via the OGPU because they judged they were close enough physically and astrally to the secret police to influence them by occult means. Because the secret police were always torturing people in their basements, the members of the order Emesh believed that they could harness the astral energy that was emanated from the suffering souls and use it to kind of defeat the Bolsheviks by spiritual means. Now, I read that, I was like, oh my God, I thought this just sounds terrible. Black magic by everybody, basically. It sounds wrong in every possible way. What's interesting about those guys was they were really deep Christians. So they were when I read further into their testimonies and who they were, and there's a very good book that people I think should read by Daniel Shulbin, which is about some of the other occult groups as kind of top context for these guys that we're talking about. But he really talks about all the others, including, some of these later groups, including the Order Emesh. And, the characters he described are young, idealistic, 23, 24, devout Christians, into the Solovyov Sophianic philosophy. So they were obviously well intentioned, but they were living in such terrible times. They had this belief. Their manifesto for the Order Emesh, it was basically a 9-point plan for how to control the world, as a secret order. Now, the first few, the manifesto, you can read it. It's something that there's a Russian scholar called Konstantin Burmistrov, I think, who published it, and I've republished it in places. It starts off fairly kind of straightforwardly in the sense that the first steps involve the formation of the group. That there's going to be an outer order, there's going to be kind of the structure of how the order is put together, with various levels of knowledge being given to the people as they're initiated higher up the group. I think they felt that their success with the plan ended around what I believe, if I remember correctly, was point 5, which was to do with the inner order being formed, because they already knew who the inner order was anyway, because they were the inner order. Todor and Tchaikovsky, but the inner order. But then in the higher points of this manifesto, you've got things like mental control of the world, astral control of the world, and then ultimately spiritual control of the world, which I, as a Christian, don't believe is possible, because I believe God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, that's they're in charge of the spiritual, ultimately the spirits of the world. But the idea of astral and mental control and psychic control as well, that material. Now, you see that when they were raided their headquarters, the secret police took the material and it formed the basis of what became the Moscow Brain Institute. And out of the Moscow Brain Institute, that's where the psychic spying program came out, which then forced in America the CIA to have its own spies, Uri Geller and Pat Price and Ingo Swat. It was that in retaliation for what the Soviets were doing. So really the worst thing possible happened in that this very, very secret occult material was taken by the Bolsheviks and totally subverted, which is how black magic works. It can only work by subverting something well-intentioned on the light side. And it became really the egregore of communism sprang out of that, but it was given a very powerful occult underpinning from these real occultists. So that was terrible. And I've sort of thought about all this long and hard, because I've been quite, the whole, Tomberg himself talks about the revolutions and the catastrophe. And, I've long thought that the world, such a terrible thing happened with World War One, and particularly that was the start of this terrible age for mankind. It was such a horrific thing that happened during this war. So I've delved into it very deeply. But I spoke to a professor of, actually he was like a leading professor in Georgia, and his subject was Islam and terrorism. I can't remember his name, but I could get that to you. And he sort of told me how Stalin, he was, as you know, born in Georgia, and he was an adept at a form of ancient lunar magic, which is sort of their folk magic in Georgia. And he explained how he was very powerful at this, and it was to do with the way he spoke, and that was a large part of it, as Hitler did for his own part with the Black Sun in Germany. So I really saw this as the kind of egregore of communism as the Black Moon, and the egregore of Nazism as the Black Sun. And really during the Cold War, this vortex formed that just started to pull humanity in. That would be an example, I suppose, of a false binary taking control of the world, because we're kind of locked between, you could call it it's a symbolic name if you like, if people don't quite agree that with the terminology. But for me, I just see as being between this vortex of powers, which are essentially the same thing but keeping everyone trapped, and
that
we
is
have to find a way up and out.
that definitely is the premier false binary today. That's a great way to phrase it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Scary stuff. Charlotte, thank you very much. And hopefully we could.
Thank you. Thanks for asking.